It's 1:30, so we'll start our program. I'm Eric Gleason, president of the original Wasco County Courthouse Preservation Organization. I always get the name wrong. Anyway, I'd like to welcome you all here for the first of our 4 programs this year. This is our 46th year of putting on history programs in February, so it's always a great event, and we're always glad to share this with the community. There's one seat right here in the front row.
One here too.
And one there. So.
Do you want to take your opinion? Right down this row. Okay. I'll go back downstairs.
There's one in the front row too.
Oh, is there?
Yeah. So we're really excited to have a bunch of different programs, and Carl will kind of inform you about future programs. And we'll just like to remind everybody to turn their cell phones off and stuff so we don't get interrupted during the programs. And so this first program is presented by a couple of folks, Barbara Telfer, who served time as a fire lookout. I don't know if served time is is exactly correct. And Rick McClure, who's a retired Forest Service archaeologist and cultural resource preservation guy, and a long-term friend. So without further ado, I'll introduce Carl, who will talk more about the future programs.
And you believe 46 years. Every year we think we've exhausted all the possible programs that we might do. We keep coming up with other good ones this year. So next week, Eric and Jackie are going to talk about the Suffolk Brothers Cannery, the China Crew. Then we have Joseph Brown, the Jewish merchant, buried up outside of the Pioneer Cemetery. And then the last program will not be here at the courthouse, it will be at the Granada Theater. And Chuck Gomez promises to do tours of the theater and give a lot of the history of that place, which has been so much of the city's entertainment over the years. I want to encourage a couple things. One is memberships. More members, the better. And that, of course, is one way of raising some funds that keep the doors open here. The other thing is we pass the sock around, and any contributions that show up in the sack, we'd be happy to put that to the same cause. We have a drawing at the end of the program, so don't go away right after the program. We'll have some gifts here, and each week we'll have a little drawing. What else do I need to say? Eric has given the quick introduction. Barbara needs no introduction. She's been a member of this board in the past. Her father was with the fire department here in town many years. Also on the board, one of the officers was a treasurer for many years. So she comes by it naturally. At times in the forest fire lookouts. And Rick, you have the introduction by his colleague Eric, archaeologist. They treasure this history, and Rick is very deeply into preserving it, the existing lookouts that we still have, and the ones that are gone now, but there are still artifacts, still stories to be heard about those many old places that are so important to fire suppression and preservation of our forests. Anything else we need to do before we start? Okay, I think Rick's going to start out. Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you, Carl. Can everybody hear me okay? Back row? Thumbs up? All right? Good. Okay, so I think today you're going to hear 2 different perspectives on fire lookouts. One that's very close and intimate to the experience of being a fire lookout, being up on those mountaintops in the summer slightly different perspective from my angle, that is the historic preservation side of looking at lookouts as an important part of our history that we're losing and trying to do what we can to protect some of that history. So I'll start out just a little introductory thing here with this first slide. This is High Rock Lookout. It's on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington, north of here. And it's one of our current projects that we're trying to preserve and protect. This is a very iconic lookout. It's probably on more calendars and in field guidebooks than just about any lookout in the state of Washington, if not the entire Pacific Northwest, because of its iconic view of Mount Rainier to the north. That's why so many people go up there. It's one of the most visited lookout spots in the Northwest. Anyways, I am now in my retirement. I've worked for the Forest Service for 34 years as a historic preservation specialist, as an archaeologist, as a heritage program manager. Also did tribal relations for part of that time. I worked on both the Mount Hood National Forest and the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. And in my retirement, I think it was actually at my retirement party that a friend and colleague who founded the Sand Mountain Society, an historic preservation nonprofit that specializes in fire lookout restoration. He approached me at my retirement and said, well, now that you're retired, how would you like to join the board of our organization and help us with our mission? And I said yes, and that was like 10 years ago. So since that time, I've learned a lot. I'm not a particularly handy guy. Eric can vouch for that because we've worked on projects together. But I've been learning to become more handy in the hands-on part of historic preservation. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in these slides. But the Sand Mountain Society, as I said, it's a nonprofit. It's a 501c3 nonprofit founded in 1989, Portland-based, and since 1989 has had a cadre of, a pretty small cadre actually, of really devoted lookout enthusiasts that are out there every summer in their spare time. These are mainly people that have day jobs. They're not retired like me. We have a few retirees. But they're out there working on projects to ensure the preservation of lookouts all over the state of Oregon. With this project at High Rock, the organization has branched out into the state of Washington for the first time. So these are some of our members, some of the folks that are out there every summer working on various projects. Some of these folks are former Forest Service. Many of them got into the organization because, like Barbara, they had worked on fire lookouts at one point in their youth and have very fond memories of these places and want to see them preserved. So Sand Mountain Society, if you want to learn more about Sand Mountain Society, or even join our organization, just do a Google search for Sand Mountain Society. We have a website that has information about our projects. But we're a volunteer-based organization. We operate pretty much out of our own pockets. We have received a few grants. I think our current treasury budget, we're running at about $30,000 in our treasury right now. Most of that funding that's come from donations, grants, goes into materials, paying counts are a very important part. But I want to say that if you want to learn more about how the Forest Service really jumped into firefighting in a big way, read this book by Timothy Egan, The Big Burn. This, I can't remember the year this was published. It hasn't been out that long. But it's a good presentation about the birth of the Forest Service, the creation of the Forest Service in 1905. President Roosevelt signs into law the Transfer Act that creates the Forest Service, puts Gifford Pinchot at the head of this new agency. Gifford Pinchot was a prominent conservationist at the time. He heads up the agency at the beginning, and it's in 1910 that the western United States, Montana in particular, experiences some of the worst wildfire events the country had seen. And that leads to the Forest Service really becoming a fire protection agency in its early formative years. When we talk about fire lookouts as having an important place in the history of the Forest Service, I like to point out this book. You probably can't see it in the dark too well, but this is a book written by Dr. Gerald Williams. He was the Forest Service historian nationally for the Forest Service. He was based in Portland, passed away just a few years ago, but one of his accomplishments around the time he retired from the Forest Service was writing a book on the history of the U.S. Forest Service in the Pacific Northwest region. And what did he pick to put on the cover of the book? A fire lookout. So it shows you how iconic and emblematic fire lookouts are with respect to the early mission of the Forest Service. He talks about the early years of the Forest Service as being the custodial era of land management, where the concern was to protect what's out there, and later the Forest Service shifts into more of an extractive mode with emphasis on timber sales and other forms of management. But in the early years, after 1905, it was really about resource protection, and fire lookouts play a big role there. So when the Forest Service realizes that they need to do more proactive work in terms of detecting fires before they start or before they get too big, they begin looking at putting what are called fixed point detection stations out on mountaintops that had good visibility, where you could really get a good lay of the land that you were concerned with. And in the early years, right after 1910, the fires of 1910, they really didn't have a standard design for these lookout stations. In fact, in the early days, they had what were called rag camps, where they send somebody out on horseback with a canvas tent set up on a mountaintop and hope for the best. And usually just during periods of high fire danger, lightning strikes, after lightning strikes, things like that. And most of these locations were hard to get to then. You could only get to these mountaintops often by trail at that time. And this is one of the earliest lookouts that I've been able to find a photograph of from our area. This is Sleeping Beauty lookout. If any of you know where Trout Lake is, I'm from Trout Lake, not far away from here. This was the first lookout on Sleeping Beauty, and it's not a standard design. This was sort of something the rangers came up with. Very small little, looks like a toll booth. Toll booth on top of the mountain there. But what a great photo. This had an excellent view. You can see the Trout Lake Valley down below. You can just about see my house from this picture. And but the point of this picture is Forest Service didn't really have a standard design at that time. It was anything goes. More often than not, it was a canvas tent. Then the situation kind of changes. In 1915, the Forest Service decides they want to adopt a more residential type building, a building that you could actually sleep in. You can see that the toll booth wasn't going to accommodate a bed very easily, much less a desk and a firefinder to spot for fires. So in 1915, a man named Elijah Coleman, who was working on the Mount Hood National Forest, came up with the prototype design on the ground floor, and then a little perch on the top that had a platform, a table platform, with a device called a firefinder. And you can see this a little bit later after we break up. This is a small size firefinder. It's kind of like an alidade. It's for sighting locations for fires, and has a map in the center, and then crosshairs and a rotating guide on the top. One of those would have been in every lookout. There's a large size and a small size. This is the small size, which you could have taken out to a rag camp on top of a mountain, carry it on your horse. These were also used in smaller emergency lookouts that were 10 by 10 feet in size. So this cupola style lookout, first one was finished in late 1915 on the summit of Mount Hood. And this becomes the design that's adopted for the time period from 1915 into the late 1920s. All the lookouts built by the Forest Service in that time period are pretty much fitting this design. So the one on the left you see is from the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest Twin Buttes lookout. That's no longer there. And the one on the right, same design, same model, Black Butte, Oregon. That one is still there. It has been preserved. There's a local group that's done restoration work on that lookout. So that's very close to Sisters, Oregon. So that's the cupola style. And that, like I said, came into being in 1915. Now what they determined on some of these that were put on the higher peaks, like Mount Adams had one of these, Mount Hood had one of these, Mount St. Helens. They decided that the higher peaks, the big volcanoes, were not great places to put these lookouts because often you're up there above the clouds and you couldn't even see the forest down below. So ultimately the higher peaks were abandoned as lookout points, and they put more on the lower elevation peaks. Now in 1929, Forest Service decided they needed a new design. They didn't like the cupola idea that well. So an engineer architect working out of the Missoula office of the Forest Service named Clyde Ficken came up with the design for what becomes known as the L4 style lookout. And this first L4 style lookout was nicknamed the Grange Hall style because it had a gable roof on the top, just 2 pitches on either side. And this is one of Ficken's original drawings from 1929. And this becomes the standard that the Forest Service uses for, well, on through the Great Depression. So 1929, Ficken uses this as the prototype for the first ones built in Montana at that time. And then by 1930, this design is adopted here in Washington, Oregon for the Pacific Northwest region. And it becomes the most popular type. More lookouts are built of this style than any other in the rest of the history of the Forest Service. So High Rock Lookout is one that I'm currently involved in restoring. And this is a 1940 picture from the family of one of the lookout people staffed there of High Rock Lookout. This was built in over 2 years, over 2 summers. It was a long trail, over 20 miles to get to this by mule. It took them 2 years to get everything up there and to get it built. So it was completed in 1931. So just to remind you in terms of history, this was before the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was in the Great Depression, but before the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1933. So in 1933, with all the labor that comes with the Civilian Conservation Corps and the extra money that came with the New Deal program, Roosevelt's New Deal program, they had lots of money to put more of these on mountaintops. And what the Forest Service does is it takes this design, Ficken's design, 1929 design, and they go to the Aladdin Company, which was a house building company that, based in the Midwest, that did kit houses that you could buy and have shipped to your property, and they were really see the firefinder that I talked about that's in this photo, and you can see why glass walls are important. So from an architectural standpoint, we would say that the windows in a lookout are a distinguishing architectural characteristic. They're very integral to the appearance and the function of the lookout. So over time, over the time period from 1929 into the 30s, the Forest Service went through 3 different designs. They did tweaks and modifications to the L4 design. They decided that the gable roof structure was not that great, and they went with a hip roof structure by 1934. So what that means is there are fewer of these Grange Hall style L4s in existence than there are later models of the lookout. So these are the, I think there's only, these are the surviving Grange Hall L4s in Washington and Oregon with the locations listed there. So you can see Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest has the largest number in Washington. And then we have High Rock that is our current project I talked about. We have Bald Butte Lookout on the Fremont Waimea, one on the Umatilla National Forest, and then Sand Mountain Lookout on the Willamette. So our organization, our nonprofit, takes its name from Sand Mountain Lookout that you see here, because that was the first project that our organization did in 1989. There was a fire lookout on the Rogue River National Forest, Southern Oregon, that was being disposed of, and the Sand Mountain Society organized in its first project to dismantle Whiskey Peak Lookout on the Rogue River National Forest, move it up to Oregon, and replace Sand Mountain Lookout that had been burned down by the Forest Service in the 60s. So it's a replica, essentially, of what was on Sand Mountain, but it's taking original lookout materials from another lookout to rebuild what was there, since it was the same design. So it's reusing or repurposing another lookout for that purpose. So those are the other examples that are left of that early style. Now here's the hip roof style L4 that comes in by 1934. This is Grassy Knoll Lookout, again on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. There's a nice trail to the lookout site if you ever get a chance to hike over that area. It's on the divide between Wind River and Little White Salmon River on the Washington side. And this was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. We've got good documentation of that. They set up a field camp, tent camp, in the summer of 1936 and built this lookout, which is on a short tower. And this is one that was burned down years later when it was no longer needed. Now in the 1940s, Barbara's going to talk a bit about the job of a lookout, but up until the 1930s, it was rare to see women working in the Forest Service at all, unless they were clerks or typists. But with the onset of World War II, a lot of the seasonal workforce for fire lookouts and firefighting in general went off to war. And with the loss of all these young men going off to war, the Forest Service decided to hire women to serve in this position. So you see a big influx of women coming into the agency. And here's a great photo from the National Archives, actually, showing Eleanor Bradley being trained in how to use one of these firefighters at Little Baldy Lookout. Little Baldy Lookout was on the ridge system to the west of Hewsum, over in Skamania County, Washington, between the Little White and the White Salmon River there. And that's another lookout that's gone. One of the most famous writers of the women's experience in district, the Mineral Ranger district, which was is now part of the Gifford Peninsula, but was part of the Snoqualmie National Forest. Here are the women lookouts in 1944. Then in the 1950s, the Forest Service decides to phase out the L4 style lookouts that they've used since 1930 and go with a new design. So the Forest Service architect at that time, who was based in the Portland office, his name was Benny DiBenedetto. He was a very highly respected and well-trained architect. He designed churches, he designed residences, houses, all kinds of things. And then he got hired by the Forest Service to do Forest Service buildings. And he came up with this design in 1959 for a slightly larger lookout. Now the L4 lookouts that I've talked about were 14 by 14, standard, 14 by 14 feet square. His new design, he decided they needed a little more room. Lookouts needed a little more room at that point. So they went to a 15 by 15 lookout with a flat top roof, which was really unique. The idea was that they're going to reflect the sun, the snow's going to melt off the top anyways. So they put a flat top roof with layer after layer after layer of tar paper on the top to create a permeable barrier, or a barrier that would help, the black material would help reflect the snow and melt it off. And instead of using shutters like you saw on the L4 lookout that would kind of block the sun at certain angles, they went with an overhanging roof that would serve that same purpose and not use any shutters at all. So some interesting differences in the design, in the function, and I'm not sure which works better, but I can tell you that these roofs became a problem in terms of leaking and things. But we did a restoration project on one of these back in about 20 years ago, and we had brown roofing from here in the Dalles, came and put on a membrane to replace the tar paper roof instead, and it was a much better fit. Of course, they didn't have that technology in '59, but that's what's on it now, and it's been restored, and that was Red Mountain Lookout over on the Mount Adams district. So that last model, this R6 flat roof model lookout, was the last standard design that the Forest Service used for lookouts. They did some prototypes right after World War II, 1946, 47, 48. They built 3 prototype lookouts that were never duplicated anywhere else. And but these designs, these R6 flat designs, were adapted throughout the region. There are several examples on the Mount Hood that are still there today. Clear Lake, I think, and Flag Point were both of the same type. But what happens in the 60s changes everything. In the 1960s, the Forest Service goes to aerial observation, the use of aircraft flying back and forth over the forest to do the same kind of detection that someone sitting in a little building on top of a mountain was doing before. And literally what you see between 1964 and 1969 is the Forest Service decommissioning. The Forest Service stops hiring fire lookouts, except in rare instances, like Barbara's.
State.
Oh, were all 3 of those state?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so that's different. And anyways, by 1969, the Forest Service is burning down most of the lookouts that still existed on mountaintops at that time on Forest Service land. And along those lines, I should mention that I just learned last week the last fire lookout on Washington State Department of Natural Resources land, the Aeneas lookout, Okanagan County, Washington, was destroyed by order of the director of DNR, Washington DNR, in November. And a contractor was hired to go up and remove that lookout, and they put up a camera on a pole to serve the same purpose. And that's the way it's gone in Oregon as well. ODF, Oregon Department place like Roseburg in a district office and watch monitors from cameras instead of putting people out there on the ground. So times have really changed. So this, of course, means there are fewer and fewer lookouts all the time. And the other thing that's working against this is wildfire frequency, and human involvement as well. Here's one of the last of the L4 lookouts in Oregon on the Willamette National Forest. The Lolly Mountain lookout was destroyed by an arson fire in the fall of 2019. And with this kind of attrition, we seem to be losing a lookout almost every year in either Washington or Oregon. And it's the same with other historic Forest Service buildings as well. A lot of them have fallen into neglect when they're no longer needed for administrative purposes, and you don't have a nonprofit out there that's willing to do the work to keep them alive. We're going to lose them. Then there's the events of nature. We see wildfire frequency. Eric, you may know the answer to this question because it was in the news in the last few weeks. How many historic structures were lost in the California fires in the last couple of weeks? It was something like over 80 some National Register listed buildings were lost in the fires just in the last few weeks in California. So these natural events they play hell on historic properties. Bull of the Woods Lookout, Mount Hood National Forest, is another recent example, destroyed by a wildfire in 2021. This was one of our organization's projects. We had staged new roofing materials in the lookout. We had tools cached there. We had other materials inside the lookout ready for our parties to go out there to work on the lookout. And we were told there was a fire in progress nearby and we couldn't go in. And by the time we were able to go in, the picture on the right shows you what it looked like. The fire had destroyed all of our work. We'd done substantial work on this lookout in 2006 with a party of volunteers, done a lot of good stabilization work, and this was another loss. So this, like I said, seems to be happening almost every year. But sometimes, the agencies themselves, as I've indicated, they don't have a need or a use for these anymore, and they see them as a liability and a safety hazard, a public safety hazard. And there have been lawsuits in the past where people have been injured climbing up a tower like this, and the agencies don't want to have the liability of people being injured out there. So here's an example of one where this is on the Deschutes National Forest. Fox Butte is a really interesting geological feature that rises up out of the Sagebrush Sea east of Bend. It's the far eastern edge of the Deschutes National Forest, out surrounded by places, BLM lands, and it's really unique. It's not like a site in the middle of the Cascades because you're surrounded by all this flat sagebrush land. And this is a lookout that has two different styles. It's got a Grange Hall style roundhouse that was moved from another location and developed into the living quarters for the fire lookout that would be stationed here and working in a little 8x8 cabin at the top of this structure. Now I think this is an 80-foot tower. It's an 80-foot steel tower, and this is yet another design I hadn't mentioned. This is called the Air Motor design. It's a company out of the Midwest that made windmills, converted its operations into making fire lookouts back in the 1930s. So this is a 1930s lookout it's pretty much all steel construction and minimal amount of wood for the box at the top. But the box was just designed to have a fire finder and a stool. Living quarters, like I said, down below. Now, the Forest Service was going to dispose of these. They published a notice of that on their website, and we intervened, our organization intervened. We asked for a meeting with the Forest Service, and they've agreed to let us do some work to preserve these two structures. So the flip side of that was there were two other lookouts that they were planning to destroy, and both of them were in really bad shape. One of them had been modified substantially, no longer had a lot of its historic material. And the other one had been vandalized so terribly that we asked for a compromise that they could get rid of the other two historic lookouts while preserving these two. So I think that was a win-win. And these are in really good condition because it's a nice dry site, doesn't get the amount of rain that we get in the Cascades. All right, so High Rock Lookout. I want to move to finish up with a talk about the project we're in the middle of right now at High Rock, which I mentioned earlier. A lot of planning has gone into this project. We went up in 2015. We were asked by a local historical society. So it was a group from outside the Forest Service was concerned about protecting a site in their backyard. Folks who had formed a museum and a historical society in the town of Packwood, Washington, were concerned about this lookout. They had a founding member who had been the last lookout at High Rock, and they said, what can we do to save this structure? And we met with Forest Service representatives, so it became a three-party project with the Forest Service, Sand Mountain Society, and the White Pass Country Historical Society and Museum. And the museum started a fundraising effort, and in short order, they were able to raise $35,000 to go into this project. And we've been having planning meetings on a regular basis since 2015, really. And then in 2020, we developed a written plan, a detailed written plan, something that federal agencies are required to do, called an historic property management plan that talks about what it is we want to preserve about that building, how we're going to do the restoration, and then looks at the future. What are you going to do with this once you've restored it? It doesn't do good to restore a building unless you have plans for how you're going to use it. So we did that, and then in 2020, COVID hit, and the Forest Service told us that we could only do very limited work there. So our project in 2020 was to take all the windows out of the lookout and have them packed down off the mountain on people's backs. You can see two ladies there each carrying a window out on a pack frame. All the windows went out that way, and then into a shop in Albany, Oregon. One of our members operates Vintage Windows LLC, a company that specializes in the restoration of windows like the ones you see here in this room. And they do courthouses and historic Forest Service ranger stations, and this guy really is an artisan. And here he is repairing a window that's from High Rock Lookout that's very badly damaged. There's been vandalism. People have kicked out the muntins in between the panes of glass. And so he's replacing those. He's got the tools and the equipment to replicate the exact profiles of each of these elements that go into building a window. So we were really limited in 2020 with the work we could do. 2021, we were able to return to the mountain. There's a great view showing what it looks like. It just drops off for hundreds of feet on one side there. And you've got this little basement area underneath that's kind of on sloping rock that I'll talk about more in the next few slides. But here we are arriving on scene in 2021 with full crew of people to do the work we plan to do. And we began taking the lookout apart. And when we did our condition assessments before we designed the plan for the restoration, we didn't really take things apart pieces. And this is all very labor-intensive work. Here we are getting down there to the very last part of the framework. The roof is off, as you can see in this picture. You can see we're just down to the bare studs. And here we are getting very close to the end of the disassembly. There's a sequence from June 25th to July 2nd, working day after day to take that thing apart. And then all of the material was bundled and carefully packaged, put into cargo nets, and taken off the mountain by helicopter. So we completely disassembled the building. And we felt that this was necessary when we saw the amount of rot that was in the structural elements. So the idea was to take all the original materials down to a shop. First getting it off the mountain was the critical part. And you can see in this far photograph, the lookout's actually on that point of rock in the background. And you can see the helicopter bringing the load down into the back of a Forest Service truck there. This guy was great. The pilot was excellent. It took him 7 minutes to get from the lookout to the pickup truck and 7 minutes back. So it was straight shot right up to the top of the mountain, down to the parking area where there's a trailhead, a very popular trailhead for hikers. And he was able to put those loads right into the back of the pickup truck without taking out the back window, which is pretty good. And we had lots of visitors during our project in 2021. So we set up an information station at the trailhead, and we had a volunteer, one of our volunteers in Forest Service uniform, telling people, you know, to be careful and to avoid the work area and all of that. We were swamped up there. There were days when there were 200 people on the top of the mountain. 55 cars I counted at the trailhead a couple of times. I mean, it's a very, very popular place. And we had people crawling over us while we're wielding power tools and things. So next phase of work that I'll talk about, we're going to have a closure order up there. So we have a little privacy while we're working. But we were fortunate to have Oregon Public Broadcasting come up and film our work there. So how many of you have seen Oregon Field Guide? Looks like everybody's pretty familiar with Oregon Field Guide. So Ian McClure, producer of Oregon Field Guide, has been following the work on our project for years. He's assembled a lot of footage of the work we've done. And here's his cameraman there with pack stock. We had some support from a packer, dual packer, to carry supplies in and out in 2021. And they're going to be back hopefully this summer. We go back to put the lookout back up on the mountain. We made some interesting discoveries. I mentioned these were Aladdin kits. These lookouts were kits. We found, here's a packing label. One of the boards had a packing label on it for the kit material. Here's some boards that we ran across that are numbered, that tell you what they're used for. Ball ties, stud braces. So this, what we've never been able to find, and it's got to be out there somewhere, is a packing list that lists what all these numbers, how many of each there are and all of that. We've never found one of those, but somewhere somebody must have an Aladdin Company archive with that information. It would be really a great artifact to find in an archive somewhere. But I talked about the rot we ran into. Here's one of the supporting beams for the lookout, a 6x6 Doug fir post or a beam. That's going to have to be replaced. So we have one of those that we've milled this last year on the Willamette National Forest. We were able to mill a bunch of these larger timbers from a nice straight grain old growth Doug fir, and those are curing right now. We'll be bringing those up this summer in the rebuild effort. Here's some more rot you can see in a corner post. So now you can see why all the boards had to come off. We have to get these rotten elements out and replace them with something that's solid. So Since 2021, we've been doing a lot of off-site work for this particular project. Now, meanwhile, Sand Mountain Society is doing projects on multiple lookouts in Oregon. Nothing quite to the extent of this, more maintenance type work, but we have work going on the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, the Willamette National Forest, the Deschutes National Forest, and then this project that I've talked about here. But this off-site work is very important. All that lumber that we took off the mountain in 2021, we stamped it. A lot of it was painted, so it went into a company in Portland that did lead paint removal, chemical stripping company. And so because of that, we had to stamp the lumber with something that would survive that stripping process. We'd originally written on all the lumber. We numbered everything when we took it out of the lookout. Numbering sequence, we mapped the locations of these doors. We wanted them to go back where they came from originally when we put the building back together. So we'd written with Sharpies, and we knew that the Sharpie would come off when it went through the stripper. So you can see we've stamped the lumber, the backside, with a numbering system. And we have lots of great carpenter type folks that are volunteering to help with this restoration effort. There's some more shots of the window work, restoring damaged windows, replacing elements that were either broken or damaged or decayed. And a lot of repair work. You can see gluing in process there, fixing boards. You know, one of our principles with historic preservation is you keep as much of the original material as you absolutely can. You don't replace something unless it absolutely is not going to work. And that's what we've done. It's very time consuming, which is why it's gone on from 2021 to 2025 now. So we have now assembled most of the material, ready to go back up there. We'll be doing some more workshop sessions like this in the spring with volunteers like these folks. And then hopefully in July 7 is the date we've proposed to have a helicopter to fly everything back up there and put this lookout back together. We'll be establishing a field camp right below the lookout and spending the entire summer with work crews putting that lookout back together. And then the local historical society will pick up from there in 2026 to staff the lookout with volunteers from the historical society. So our goal is to have a restored and functional lookout that embodies the historic period of significance, the 1930s, 1940s period. We want it to look like it did then, so the visitors, all these hundreds of visitors that come up there, will have an appreciation for Forest Service history, fire detection, and this time period that now is so much further back there. So that's my story today, and I think we'll turn it over to Barbara, and I will, there's a slide that goes along with Barbara's. Oops. Sorry. There. All right. So, if you have questions, ask me later.
Well, this is the only photo we have. I was so relieved to find out they initially asked me to do a program on the Forest Lookout, and I'm going, oh my God. And then when I found out Rick was going to do like the heavy lifting, and I was just supposed to tell my stories, I'm going, oh, that's great. So I pretty much just thought up my stories that I've been telling since I was a lookout. So I was a lookout at 3 different lookouts. Wasco Butte was the one that was closest. That's the one you have here. I was first at Foreman Point, which is down. You go like you're going to Moppet, and then you turn like you're gonna go to government camp. You go to Pine Grove, and there used to be a little store there, and the guy that worked there also worked for the Forest Service, and he supplied that, the lookout up there. It was in the McQuinn Strip, so I don't know when, but years after I was there, they gave that back to the native, to the reservation. And then they pulled me out of one of those towers and put me in a place called Bald Butte, although not the Bald Butte picture that you saw. It was in the Upper Hood River Valley, and it was the 70s, and the woman who originally had worked in that tower had taken her 4 days off and just not come back. She'd gone to a music festival or something, and so they said, oh, okay, you're gonna go, we're gonna take you there. So they took me up to Bald Butte. So that was interesting. Got a couple of stories for that. Mainly, I'll tell you first what your schedule was as a lookout. You had check calls from 8 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock at night every 2 hours. You were expected to be up and looking around and keeping those windows clean. I mean, thank God you had something to do because it could get really boring there. But you had your check calls, and they would sometimes come up to the, well, for us, we didn't have to haul our water. The forest people, and I worked for this Oregon State Forestry, and so they would come up and they would have 5-gallon jugs of water, and water weighs 8 pounds a gallon, so you learned that. At Bald Butte, they had it was a milk can, and there was a pulley, and so I would go down there and I'd fill things out. They'd fill the milk can, and I'd go out there and I'd fill up my little water container and carry it up until the milk can got about halfway full. And so then I'd use the pulley to pull it up, except for that one time when it fell and I tried to stop it, the rope with my hands. And it was a big old pumpkin rope, and I was picking rope slivers out of my hands for like days. And when it goes, never grab the rope. That's just, it's a good lesson to learn. So at Foreman Point, so you can see the senior moments are hell. The covers of the windows, they're up and they're on. You've got a big, huge beam, and they're screwed into that and everything. So the first night I was at a tower, they took me up to Foreman Point, and we took up my stuff and my food, and I was terrified because I just knew fires are going to pop out all over the place, and I didn't know, what to do. So I managed to make it through that first day without being immolated. But then at night, the wind came up, and those shutters, that's the word I couldn't find, those shutters were going like crazy. Now, this tower had been used for decades, but it didn't matter to me because I knew those shutters are going to come down and I was going to wake up with glass in my face. So I pulled the mattress off of the bed and laid on the floor and slept with a towel over my head because I just knew that was the only way I was going to come out of that one. So obviously, after the first night, that was not a problem. And at Foreman Point, I was on. I had 3 radios. We were real close to the Mount Hood National Forest, so I had one there because I could see. We could triangulate that, and then I also had I was at the top of the reservation, so I had a native one, and so talk. I can't remember if this actually happened to me or if I saw it so well in my head. At the Foreman Point, it was right next to a repeater station for the telephone company. So the driving up there was really an easy thing to do. And I actually got hooked on coffee because the guys that would come up and do tests for the phone company would take a sledgehammer and pound a corner of the thing to wake me up so that I would have coffee for them. So one night, and again, I can't remember if it was me or somebody else, but it's so visual in my head. I think it was me. Turned out the lights and was in bed. And I heard a car pull up, and it parked at the bottom of the tower. Doors didn't open, didn't hear anything. Thought, that's just weird. That's weird. So I called, and I was trying to remember, I used to know the 10 code really well. I think I called 1033, which is trouble at the tower, and that's actually if you had a fire, that was what you would call. And it was during the fair, and so like some of the Forest Service guys were at the fair, and they heard that, and one of them, the guy that was out of Pine Grove, he had a beer and he just tossed it across the thing, and he almost hit somebody, but the boy, that adrenaline was pumping, and they were going, and they pulled up, and hear him on the radio, and they said, yeah, okay, we're here. Yeah, we see the car. Yeah, we're going to get out now, because they didn't know what it was. The next morning was the start of bow hunting season. And these guys had pulled out and were just going to sleep in their car. And I think they were as scared as everybody else was when somebody knocks on their door, on the window. And, okay, we just want to make sure it's fine, but next time you might want to have somebody tell you, might want to see if there's somebody up in the tower. Talking about the feds going to planes. When I was on Bald Butte, they would fly over in the morning, they'd fly down past Mount Hood, and then they'd come on back. And they started dropping things to me, because I'd get out there and I'd wave, and because they'd buzz the tower. And so one night I was there, and that was a real tough place to get to. You needed a 4-wheel drive or a Volkswagen Bug, because the Volkswagen Bug came up, and these guys got out, and we're kind of talking, and one of them says, I really like your bathrobe.
Oh, no.
Which was odd, because I was not wearing a bathrobe. I was, jeans and t-shirt and all that kind of stuff, or shorts, whatever. And I said, really? And I said, oh, you guys fly over because they would fly over, and I had this bright red and white bathrobe, and so I'd be waving at them. And they dropped me, they said, yeah, that they were doing it. They were out of Washington, and they would fly on down, and then they'd fly back, and that was their job. And they did drop me, and I had it for years and years. It was supposedly an official reporting paper for the feds for peoples. So were they in native garb or hippies or no garb at all? I mean, it was the top of the Summer of Love had happened and all of that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of that, but that was kind of interesting. But yeah, I guess I like your bathrobe. So Bald Butte was an incredible place because it was so high up. It was above ride that turbulence. I'd be watching, I'd be looking out, and there'd be a bird, and it was just soaring. And then I might I'd look or look back up, and then after a while there'd be 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 birds just soaring like that. And that tower was so high. First of all, it was really tall. It was probably the tallest one I was in, maybe 60 or 65 feet tall. But it was still so high that I could see the numbers and letters on the tops of the planes that flew thing. So, and that was, it's a very, I almost got a little dizzy the first time I saw that, because it's just not something you expect to see. And while I was there, Mount Hood was huge, just huge. And so, you know, spent a lot of time looking at Hood and all of that. And at late in the summer, on certain parts of the mountain, you could actually see green, where dirt or seed or something had gone, and there was something growing on top of the ice. And it took me about 3 days to make sure that that's what I was seeing, because after a while, when you're alone, it's kind of like, is this real? Is this, you know, not happening, or what? So when I was on Wasco Butte, that had a lot of, there was a guy that came and he collected wasps. So he had these things hung, and he'd collect them during the summer, and then he'd spend all winter sexing them and doing whatever, you know, cataloging them or whatever it was he was doing. But it made going to the outhouse kind of creepy, because you could walk along, and of course a bunch of them would be flying around. And then that would impact your cooking, because if you had meat, they would come up and you'd have to deal with that. Yeah, that was Wasco Butte was one of my favorites. I didn't tell you, Foreman Point was a unique tower in that the trap door into it entered into the actual cabin. So that was the most safe I felt in terms of, I never felt unsafe there, but just in terms of thinking about it, yeah, somebody would have to parkour around and get there. Where the other ones, they would open up, and you can kind of see there's a fairly decent walkway all the way around. And so it would usually, the door would open up onto that. So Wasco Butte was just outside of the Dalles, and so I get a lot more visitors, family and friends. And my brother loved to come up, and he would, coming up the stairs, he would do a drag. And then if it wouldn't creak, he'd make the creaky sound himself, you know. And then he'd do this. You know, his fingers like he was a monster coming up out of the thing. So I've had a lot of really interesting things happen. I've been when I was at Wasco Butte, my mom was the manager out at the country club, and I came home from a stint there, and I said, yeah, this plane has been buzzing my tower at dark when I'm taking a spit bath, you know, and that's pretty, you know, you're a little vulnerable in a building that has nothing but windows around it. And so my mom was out at the country club, and some guy made some mention of the fact that, yeah, he buzzed a lookout tower. And I don't know if any of you remember my mom, Dorothy Telfer, but she could get a little upset about something, and she kind of threatened the riot act, and I didn't have any more problem with that at all. But the most amazing thing that happened, and I knew that this was going to be the last story I told. My brother Mike came up to spend the night with her, and so we had, usually you had a couple of the 3-inch cotton mattresses. You'd have 2 of them. And, so he slept on one on the floor and I slept on the floor. It was a full moon. And I, at this point, could sleep through the full moons, but it woke my brother up. And he was looking around and he saw a flame. He goes, Barbara, there's a fire. And I said, what time is it? And he says, 4 o'clock. I said, there are no fires at 4 o'clock in the morning. And then I kind of woke up and I thought, oh no. So I got up and yes, I could see flame. So it's pitch dark, I'm working, I take my time because I want to get it good before I call in. So I figure out where it is. I've got my azimuth, my range, my northeast corner, the southeast corner of all of that stuff. And I call in and about maybe 4:45 by the time I can finally wake up and get there. And so you stay on if you call in a fire, you stay on the radio until they get, especially like if it's at dark because they might need help trying to figure out how to get there. So about 5 or so, my boss gets on the line and he says, okay, we're here. Good job. Go back to bed. So we'd already gotten dressed, and up there you had a kink from Portland. That was really cool. So we had the radio on, listening to kink, and we lay back down, and it starts to get a little bit light, and I'm laying on my side, and hood is like a third of my view. And I'm laying there, and my brother's laying on a cupboard with using the roll of paper towels for his pillow. And I open my eyes, and I'm looking at hood, and it starts glowing pink at the top. And I watch it, and it's starting to calm down. And I'm telling you now, I am totally goosebumpy right now, because it's such an incredible thing. So I go, Mike, get up and look, and it's crawling on down the face. When it gets to the timber line, we go outside, and we're listening, and there's usually around dawn, you hear chirping and this and that and everything else. It started getting quieter and quieter, and we turned around and faced east. And just as the sun cracked the horizon, we hear this. So that, and being able to share that with my brother. Well, if he hadn't been there, I don't know what would have happened. It was I nailed it. It was in slash on a lumber concern. If they hadn't have gotten on it before the sun came up, the winds would have taken off. It would have been. So I earned my money for that thing and had an incredible experience too. I can never not be grateful for the time I spent as a lookout. So, thank you.
Let's have a little time for question and answer, and then we'll have the drawing. And if somebody downstairs would bring the stubs up, and we'll put them in the jar up here and have the drawing. Let's have a few questions.
Oh, there's a question over there.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Barbara, what was your work schedule like? I mean, were you there for weeks and weeks, or
No.
what was that
The
like?
regular schedule for a regular lookout was you were on 10 you that. For lightning, you had a little stool that was 1 foot by 1 foot with glass insulators on the bottom. And you were supposed to stand on that and mark where the lightning hit so that you could do it. I just read the thing of during the war, and they, when we first started doing it, and they would put a piece of white paper over it so you wouldn't mark up the map, and I thought, oh yeah, that would have been good. So, but yeah, lightning.
I have to tell you, Barbara, I have that stool. I'm gonna ask you, I see what happened. Do you have a picture of Foreman Point?
No,
Okay.
why, you?
No, I don't.
Oh.
We've got a picture of Wasco View. Foreman Point was the duplicate, basically, of Wasco.
It's the same style, but like I
Yeah,
said,
but-
it was the only one that had the door into
Right,
it
right,
in the
right.
center. Oh, and it had nice floors. The floors were really pretty.
There was a guy that wrote a book on the lookouts of the Northwest, and the one he couldn't find was Foreman Point. And I asked you one time at the library,
Yeah.
I need to look at that. Question back there? Oh. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. My uncle worked at the lookout, and there's a classic family story about one day all gathered around at Grandma's house, and he said, you know, that reminds me of a lookout story. And without a word being said, everyone stood up and walked out of the room. This is way better than that, way better than that.
Wait, so you never heard the story then?
We never heard the story.
So I spent a couple of weeks in Wasco View Lookout over 2 different summers. My sister Mary graduated from high school in 1965 and became a fire lookout at Wasco View for 2 years. So maybe in 14, 15, we go up and I'd stay for a week or a month, or 2 days. So I saw my first rattlesnake. The wind does blow up on Wasco View. And this was before they started putting rock down on all the county roads to get up there. And so the dust on the roads was like finest powder and all would creep into any crack or crevice in the cars we were driving on, either on the Lisbon cutoff or coming up Shannon Creek. And the sideline of that is somehow now I'm living a half mile below the lookout site. And it's sure about half the stars, nothing planned.
It's in your blood.
And it's a nice ski trail when you got winter snow across from the stream up around the lookout.
Wow.
Actually, I had, when I was at Wasco View, you were in it, and to the west was green, and to the east was brown. And Peter Byrne, the guy that had the Bigfoot thing, he came up to my tower and said, so do you think a man-sized animal could work its way through here? And it's like, yeah.
Question?
When Phil mentioned rattlesnakes, it reminded me of a story I read that in 1953, the state forester didn't believe there were any rattlesnakes around Wasco Lookout. So one day, when an employee shows up and dumps a paper bag and dumps it on his desk, it has a live rattlesnake.
Souvenir.
Yeah.
Any other questions about lookouts? Yeah.
They rent them out, don't they, for people to camp over?
Yeah, the Forest Service does. So, in fact, our organization has restored several that are in the rental program. And that's one of the benefits. Since the Forest Service doesn't need them anymore, the the National Forest Fire Lookout Association has a website that I think has an interactive map that you can go to, and then you can click on the dots and it'll show you a photograph of the lookout. So look for the Forest Fire Lookout Association. It's FFLA website, and it has lists of the lookouts, and then I think that's the one that has the interactive map as well. Yeah.
Just to clarify a little bit, I'm retired from an outdoor forest for, when I came in 1962, we had, I think, 6 or 7 active lookouts, some on range position. Today, I think there's still over, I think Flag Point is one of those. Most of them are gone.
And that story is more or less repeated on every ranger district in the country. Gifford Pinchot National Forest has 4 lookouts left, and I think I counted them all up because they've moved around. You know, some would be on a lookout or on a mountaintop for some years and then abandon and move to another location. But I think it was 80 lookout sites total and only 4 structures left. So that's a pretty small percentage. Yeah.
Do you have any idea where the foreman, lookout got its name?
No, I don't. They usually were named after people, you know, forest people, or just something odd that, you know, that I don't know. But yeah, I don't know why.
Well, it's my maiden name, and foremans were in the Antelope area and in the valley, and come from England. So and it totally puzzled us because my husband worked as a laborer on the building of the, what do we call them? The microwave station was placed there.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, that would have been in 64.
It was fairly new, and I was there, and
Yeah, well, they built them, there one on top of Moppin, and there was one out at French, or Antelope, and so, but he worked on that one, and when he came home, he said he worked there with a Foreman Point, I've never heard of it before, so.
I'll look up Oregon Geographic names. Yeah.
Do you have a copy of that? Maybe there's one on the bookshelf downstairs, right?
Well, there's one at the surgeon's quarters, and yeah.
Have you checked that? The Oregon Place Names book?
Yeah, that's a good one to check.
We tried to save Wasco View, forward for the state forest for 7 years. And we called the National Guard, and they were gonna bring up a Chinook, but they had to have an actual weight of the tower.
Kind of hard to get to, huh?
Pretty heavy, so they finally decided that they weren't gonna pick up the tower. So we hooked our D7 cat up to it, thinking we'd cut the legs out from under it and slowly lower it down. I'll just say it landed in a big pile of rubble. And it is buried right there, because I dug the hole, we pushed it all in and buried it. So if you want an archaeological site,
It's now an archaeological
Former
site.
point is exactly the same thing.
Oh,
It's buried right where it stood.
Wow. And what year was that?
That would have been 70, I don't know anymore, in the mid-70s.
In the mid-70s?
Yeah.
Wow. What a story.
That was not long after I
it's not the same, you know, it's the same one on top of the mountain. There's a couple others besides that. I mean, in one sense, Mount Adams Lookout is a cupola style lookout. If you go up there late in the season, like September, when the ice and snow have melted down, the cupola is laying there on its side, off to one side of the roof, and the whole rest of the lookout's there, but it's been encased in ice since the 30s or 40s.
Wow.
I think we're gonna have to wrap it up, and Rick, would you,
Oh, yeah, okay.
reach in there and
All right, get your numbers out, get your tag out. Make sure you shook it up good?
I did,
Okay.
shake it up again.
All right, the winner is
Sorry, number.
Sandy,
The number.
414414. That's the lucky number, 414414. Sandy,
Sandy Hager.
Sandy Hale.
Downstairs. Is she downstairs?
Downstairs, what's the,
What?
that would be the, what do you call those?
All right, Stuart. Thanks. Oh, there's another one.
That's me.
That's you, Richard. There you go.
Thanks everybody for coming. Appreciate you being here today.
Okay, we've got the number, the last, 414-4399.